Today we are going to another interesting chapter in our New Testament study, and that is the hinge of history. We all know what it means when we talk about a hinge. A hinge is a turning point, a fulcrum, a pivot, where things can, if you're having two sides and then you have the middle point in which they can balance. But also like the hinge we have in a door or window, a turning point. You close, you open. It enables the closure and the opening of our windows, our doors. We have them on our computers. Some of them are on your laptops. You have them everywhere on cupboards. So we want to see, what does it mean when we talk about the hinge of history? For Christians, the death and resurrection of Jesus in 3 days is the turning point or the midpoint of all history, because it changes human destiny from eternal condemnation to eternal life. The church in the world stands or falls on the basis of resurrection of Jesus on the Sunday morning, if she does not confess and give witness to this supernatural event to which Christianity is hinged. In other words, here we say that if Jesus Christ did not resurrect from the dead, Christianity will not be there. And as we had said earlier, that it is a turning point from eternal condemnation to eternal life. Jesus' resurrection brings hope of a new life, of a sinner who would have been condemned to eternal punishment, and Jesus brings eternal life only to those who believe and trust in him. So this brings us to look at the events that happened during the last week of Jesus' life. We begin by looking at Sunday, which we call the Palm Sunday. Christians, you experience this one. We call it Palm Sunday, we call it Holy Week. It begins the Holy Week, it begins the last week of Jesus' ministry on earth, or the last week. We see Jesus going into Jerusalem. He was staying in Bethany, so he comes down to Jerusalem, and the expectation of the people here is that he enters Jerusalem as an expected king. He enters Jerusalem as a conqueror in the minds of the Jews. But we see that this marks Jesus' final and triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He entered as a king with no force or no army. He was not armed, but he entered as a humble king, signifying the humble kingdom and the humble citizens of the kingdom. And we see that Jesus here rides on a donkey and enters Jerusalem. A donkey was a humble animal. There were 3 types of animals that we know were used during those days. The donkey, which is mostly domestic and is used for domestic purposes. A horse, which is used for war, and camels, which are used for transporting heavy loads. If he entered using a horse, it would have signified that really he has come as a warrior to fight the Roman authorities, and then there would have been a reaction from the Roman government, and they would even attack him there and then. For a camel, he would not use it because he was not carrying a load moving a distance, although we know that spiritually he was carrying a burden of the sinners. But he rides on a donkey. I think those days a donkey was signifying an animal that was in the eyes of the people, implying the humility of the person using it. But also it was a symbol of kingship, because most of the people of high caliber would you be using such an animal for transport. There were no vehicles like we have today. They would not walk on foot unless a king wanted to show off. He would use, of course, a horse. So Jesus was welcomed by a crowd singing Hosanna according to their expectations. The great Hosanna, or the Hosanna day. But while the word is certainly an overpowering of praise and not of supplication, it also carried the idea of salvation. Jewish expectations was the Israelite kingdom, as we had seen in the Gospels, like Matthew. They expected the promised Messiah to be their king and to bring back the lost kingdom of Israel, a physical kingdom with a physical king. That was the expectation. Surprisingly, when Jesus entered Jerusalem, in that kind of honor, people singing, laying down their clothes, cutting tree branches, as we are doing these days to our politicians when they are campaigning and they are being welcomed in their constituencies. You know how people welcome them, even the president. So they welcomed Jesus because that was their hope, to be liberated from the Roman authorities. Surprisingly, Jesus went to the temple instead of going straight to the Roman seat. And he goes and looks over the temple around and saw what was happening. And he leaves without doing anything and goes back to Bethany. And from what we read that follows, it tells us that the temple was being misused. They had turned it into a marketplace. People would buy and sell. And when we look into the history of the buying and selling or turning it into a market, the reasons could have been good, but then they ended up destroying the purpose of the temple. So he went back to Bethany and stayed there. The following day, which is a Monday, he comes back to Jerusalem with his disciples. And something happens. And this happens with an intention so that Jesus can demonstrate what he wants the Jews to learn about the kingdom, about their calling, about their election, about their religious beliefs. It was still early morning, and we are told that he was feeling hungry. The feeling of hunger was not a reality, because I hope where he came from he had taken breakfast. But he wanted to demonstrate something. By feeling hungry, he looked around. There were so many fig trees, but he looked at a particular fig tree. And this fig tree showed signs of having fruits on it, such that a person who is feeling hunger would go and pick fruits and eat and feel satisfied. It's like in your gardens, in your compounds, even like here at our main campus. We have so many trees that bear fruits. We have mangoes, we have guavas, we have avocados, we have jackfruits. And we know all these trees are evergreen throughout the year. And green is life. The impression they would give to somebody who is hungry is that there is something one can pick from such a tree and eat. So Jesus moved there. But Jesus knew that it was out of season. He knew it. But he wanted to demonstrate. So when he looked around the tree and could not find any fruit to eat, he cursed it. He cursed it. I want you to imagine you go home hungry. You open the fridge, there is no drink, there is no food. You go to the kitchen, there is nothing. What happens? Most of you bang doors. You bang the door because you are angry and hungry. You bang the door of the fridge because of how you feel. So Jesus, in reaction, he cursed the tree never to have any fruit on it. Some records tell us that the fruit withered there and then. Others say that when they were coming back from Jerusalem, they saw it had withered. What was the significance or the implication of what he did? This was to tell the Jews that the Jewish religion on the outside was so flourishing, so lively, like any of those trees we have mentioned. But inside there was no fruit for satisfying spiritual hunger. It was not offering salvation. It was good for nothing. That was what he was demonstrating. Then he proceeded and went to the temple which he had visited the previous evening. And because of what was going on, having been turned into a market, you know what a market entails. It has thieves, fighters, a lot of talking, bargaining, cheating here and there. Those are the things that were happening. And most of the business was taking place in the court of the Gentiles. But even right inside, there were some people. This was to avail opportunities for people who were coming outside Jerusalem or outside maybe Rome. Those are the Jews who came to celebrate the Passover, as it was mandated for every able Jew to come and celebrate with fellow Jews in Jerusalem. They would bring currencies from where they were, and the only currency that was acceptable in the temple, either to pay taxes, it was Roman currency, that was a denarius. But also the market was established to enable people who were coming from very far, instead of walking all the way with the animals for sacrifice, to come and find animals readily available in the market. Because I want you to imagine you are coming from Karamoja, you are bringing a cow to celebrate in Kampala. So many days on the road, the cow is not feeding. By the time it reaches here, it will be in a sorry state. And yet, an animal to be acceptable for sacrifice must be a well-looking animal, healthy animal without any blemish. So these markets were well intended, although they interfered with the temple and its purpose. So Jesus came ready to cleanse the temple, clear away all the business, and make it available for worshippers. And he got a cord. I don't know whether he came with it prepared, but he started beating all those who were engaged in different types of business, overturning tables of the money changers, opening the cages that contained pigeons, releasing animals, and people were scared and ran. Business was disrupted. But back at the end of the temple stood the priests who were possibly waiting for collecting temple tax. That was the revenue. Maybe that was their livelihood. And they were surprised to see a man who, so to say, was claiming to be Son of God, to be the Messiah, whom they did not recognize, whom they looked as somebody having no authority over the house of the Lord, disrupting business and claiming that this was the house of prayer. his father's house, which means that day, and maybe the days to come, there is no business. The priesthood is losing out. They will not get income. So they become so angry with him. And we are told that they planned to kill him. But not during the Passover, because it would bring commotion. What is the significance of cleansing the temple? In a spiritual realm, we say that this deals with cleansing our bodies, because, as Paul puts it, that our bodies are the temple of the living God. I want you to imagine now as I'm teaching, is it true that your focus is on what we are studying? Is it true that whenever you are seated in the church, your heart is straight, listening to the preacher? What about when you are praying? What about any business that takes place in the church? You will find that your heart is roaming about. Sometimes you are looking at your watch. You are thinking that the preacher has taken long. He should have finished because you have another business to do. Sometimes as you sit, you are thinking about the family issues. You are thinking about other transactions, such that your heart is full of other things rather than allowing God to settle in your heart as you are the temple. So this was significant to cleanse the Israelites, the Jews, of all those things that are hampering them from accepting God to sit in their hearts and control them and make them his people as it has ever been before. After that one, Jesus went back to Bethany. And remember this, now we are in the Holy Week preparing for the Passover. On Tuesday, the scriptures tell us that Jesus went at Simon the leper's house, which signifies that Simon might have been healed of leprosy and he was a friend of Jesus. Although we meet him here, we don't see him elsewhere. But this story would signify that he was a friend of Jesus among his other friends. So while he was there, we are told that a woman came into the house. And you know the perception of the Jews against women. Where men are seated, women are not supposed to be there. She was not among the invited people. But she came and entered. She had an alabaster jar full of perfumed oil. And it is said it was very expensive, made out of nard tree from India. She went straight to Jesus. I want you to imagine you have invited a visitor, somebody you don't know, somebody you have not invited, come straight to your visitor. You would react. Sometimes you would want to pull her off, or him. You would want to rebuke her. You can do any other thing in order to protect your guest. But I'm sure people were aware that Jesus used to have women around him as part of his disciples' team. So she went, opened her jar, and poured the perfumed oil right from Jesus' head, and it trickled down to his feet. I want you to imagine, most of you have been using, you buy these perfumes, and our perfumes are put in smaller bottles. There are those which are big bottles, but we use perfumes sparingly because they are expensive and they are given a place of respect because they give a good scent on our bodies. So these people saw this woman. In my mind, I thought they are asking, is this woman out of her senses? Does she know the cost of the oil she's using? And they murmured among themselves, "What a waste!" And a comment went out that they should have sold this perfume, and then the money would be used to cater for the poor. And Jesus, knowing what they were thinking, and this was coming out surprisingly from his disciples, and Jesus made a comment that for the poor, they will always be with them. They still have time to care for the poor. But for him, they will not be with him forever. And therefore, what the woman had done would leave an everlasting impact that it will ever be talked about. And sometimes you may be surprised. This woman must have spent her savings to buy this perfume for a purpose. And she was fulfilling her purpose, which she had thought over for a long time. But people who did not know why she had bought this perfume are the ones making a comment. You know, it is very easy for us always to make comments on what people do and say without knowing why they say them and do them, because we are not part of their plans. And what this woman had done is a premeditated plan in which she's being used by God. And we say here, this is a prescience of Jesus' traditional burial rituals. We shall see when somebody died, before burial, that person would be anointed, spiced, and also many other rituals are performed, and then the person is buried. But we shall see later that when Jesus dies, there is no time to anoint him. But here we see that through this prescience, Jesus is already anointed for his burial, but people did not know. Wednesday is not mentioned what happened. It is assumed that possibly Jesus might have remained at the leper's home. So it brings us to a Thursday. And on this day, Thursday is always referred to as Holy Thursday, Maundy Thursday. Something happened, or a number of things happened. Jesus instructed his disciples to prepare for the Last Supper. We don't know what was in their mind. We don't know whether the words used here are the very words Jesus used, calling it Last Supper. If he used these words, what did it mean to the disciples? But in Jesus' mind, this was the Last Supper he would have together with his disciples, and he mentioned it. And they indeed prepared, and when they were at this supper, that's where we see a number of things happening. As they were eating, Jesus told them about his last moments. That time was coming, and he was going to be powered out as somebody who is going to offer his blood for the sins of the people. And he took bread, we're told, after giving a blessing, he gave it to them and told them always to remember, whenever they partake of it, to remember him. Similarly, he took the cup and did the same. And at these suppers they were eating, he declared that one of them was going to betray him. We have many friends around us, but some of our friends are betrayers. They want to hear what you say, they want to see what you do, they want to see what you intend, or what your intentions. And naturally, I asked some people, I said, do you have enemies? Some people say, no, we don't have enemies. I can assure you, you have enemies only that you don't know them. But Jesus knew his enemy. And these enemies, because you don't know them, they will betray you. When you are pulled down, or when you fail, either in business, in education, in marital situation and whatever, you will not know who has betrayed you, but one of your friends, because they know where you go, who are your friends, what you like, what you don't like. You have had some people poisoning others. People will not poison you if they don't know what you like. What do you eat? What do you drink? Where do you sit? These are your friends or pretending friends. For 3 years, a man called Judas Iscariot has been one of the disciples and a treasurer of the team. But he grew with a spirit to betray Jesus. So he declared, one of you will betray me. And you know, when you read the scriptures, you see them turning around, asking each other, is it me, is it me? Even they ask him, is it me, Lord? And surprisingly, this man, Judas Iscariot, was sitting very close to Jesus, that they were even dipping in the same bowl. And he said, the one I'm going to give a morsel of food, bread dipped in wine or whatever, is the one who is going to betray me. We don't know when Jesus did it, how the disciples reacted. We don't see the disciples rebuking Judas, but we are told that after Judas had taken this morsel, the evil spirit took him away. And Jesus told him, you go and do your work. He went to prepare because he had agreed with the high priests and the Roman officials to betray Jesus on a pay. Sometimes this pay is not worth the human life. You have had some people betraying others, killing them, and they are paid doing this and that. 30 pieces of silver, we don't know the equivalent of this one in today's currency, but you can log and find out what could have been the equivalent of today's money. But even if you were given billions for the sake of betraying somebody's blood, it will not be worth. But he did it, one, to fulfill the scriptures, because Jesus had to die. Then at the same supper, Jesus reveals his betrayer and those who are going to deny him. He tells them that when the enemy strikes, most of them will run away and even deny him. And they all of them swore that they will never, even if it means dying, they will die with him. They didn't know. In most cases, we do swear before we know what is ahead of us, and we think that our swearing will stand the test of time, but it will not. Not until the trial comes and you find that you cannot stand it. And we know here that of all the disciples, even Peter, the strong man, the elderly man, stood out and told Jesus that even if others do deny him, even run away, he will not. And this displays the disciples' ignorance of the forthcoming Jesus' suffering and death. They didn't know what he was going to face or how it was coming. After all, Peter is one of those people who thought that the Messiah cannot die, even when Jesus had declared it. After supper, Jesus took the disciples into the Garden of Gethsemane. It appears that this was a usual place where he would retire with the disciples for prayer. And when you read through the story, we know that he left them a distance and he went to pray alone. The prayer of agony, asking God if it be possible to take away this cup of bitterness. But he tells us that it was not his will but God's will, and God's will was that Jesus should die for the sins of his people. So in the process, after 3 times coming and checking on his disciples, the people who were sent to arrest him, they come and arrested him. They came very heavily armed, and the way how they arrested him caused fear among the disciples, to the extent that most of them ran away save for Peter. And 2 things we are told here: that in the process, the people who came to arrest Jesus did not know him. So Judas Iscariot had given a sign of identifying him from others, a sign of a kiss. Kiss has been defined in 2 ways: a kiss of love and a kiss of betrayal. So Judas Iscariot kiss was a kiss of betrayal. It was not a kiss of love. He came and kissed Jesus, and Jesus told him to do what had brought him. At the same time here, when the disciples were running away, we are told that one of them, the garment he was putting around himself, fell off and he went naked. He could not think of coming back because he feared being arrested. And the person is assumed to have been John Mark, a young boy who always accompanied the disciples. For him, he was not a disciple, but a companion of the disciples. The third thing that happened, that in the process of the arrest, Peter was very angry and bitter to see the way how his master was being handled. He had come guarded with a sword. He drew out his sword and he cut off the ear of one of the soldiers, or the official of the high priest. And Jesus rebuked Peter. I want you to imagine if you were in the place of Peter. You are trying to stage a defense. You had already declared yourself that you will stand by. And Jesus rebuked Peter to return the sword into its scabbard or sheath. And he says, those who use the sword die by the sword. And surprisingly, Jesus picked the ear and replaced it on the man. You imagine you are Peter, you would think that really, and Jesus made a comment in some of these scriptures. He said, if he wanted security, defense, protection, he would call upon his Father. He would send him multitude of angels who would protect him. Now, from there, Jesus was taken before 3 different courts of law. The Bible will never tell you very clearly that there are 3 words, but you will judge according to what took place. The first court of law where he was taken was before the high priest, Caiaphas. And the purpose for this was to level against Jesus any religious accusations, any wrongs he committed from a religious point of view. And the high priest was in position to give judgment. And it is during this period, before Caiaphas and his council, that Peter denied Jesus 3 times, as Jesus had said that before the cock crows you have denied me 3 times. Jesus denied heaven on earth that he didn't know Jesus. And after his 3rd denial, the cock crew, and Peter remembered what Jesus had told him, and Jesus turned his face and looked at Peter. Their eyes met, and Peter felt sorry for denying that he never knew Jesus. And the scriptures tell us that Peter went out and cried bitterly. And from the high priest, Jesus was taken before the Sanhedrin. This is the Jewish council, the Jewish parliament. And the purpose for this Sanhedrin was to level any accusation made against Jesus for traditional and cultural commitments he made. Traditional and cultural accusations. And after the Sanhedrin had added on their findings, they sent Jesus to another court, that is, before Pontius Pilate. It is said that Jews and other nations that were under the Roman authorities, none of them was allowed to execute a criminal. So they were looking for Roman authorities to condemn Jesus to death. But here we are told that after Pontius Pilate had heard from what had come from the high priest and the Sanhedrin, and of course a big multitude had followed Jesus being dragged to Pontius Pilate, they were expecting to get the final verdict, that is, condemnation. And Pontius Pilate, after observing and understanding the accusations, he declared Jesus free. He declared innocent. But the Jews were violently said, unless he condemns him to death, they are going to accuse him to Julius Caesar, who was the emperor. And for fear of losing his seat, his bread, he bent to the requests made by the Jews. But one thing he did, he said, bring me water. And he washed his hands, claiming that he is handing over Jesus Christ to them. Let them do the needful to crucify him, because the highest punishment given to a criminal among the Romans was crucifixion. So he said, I hand him over, you go and crucify him yourselves. I wash away the guilt and blood of this man from my hands. And surprisingly, these people who were around, yes, they said, yes, let it be. Let his blood be upon us and our children. Now somebody wonders, why their children really? Some of us are living under a curse, which we do not know, that it could have been inherited from our parents. What was their own case is now transferred to us, because you can imagine here how they are saying that the blood of Jesus Christ should be upon them and their children, the children of their children. So down to the even present age, the blood is still upon them. So Jesus was handed over to them and he was taken for crucifixion. By now it is already Friday morning, and Friday in this week in the evening would be the beginning of the Passover feast at 6 o'clock, and Jesus is taken for crucifixion. We know a number of things happened here. He was beaten, he dragged his cross, which was very heavy, and we know that there is one man who was picked from those people who had come to celebrate the Passover, called Simon of Cyrene, to help carrying Jesus' cross. And at the 6th hour, that is midday, Jesus was crucified together with 3 bandits, criminals, at Golgotha. let's now change a place called Calvary. And it appears that it was the place where normally the Romans would take criminals and crucify them. So it was called the place of the skull. There were skulls there. So he was crucified, put on the cross on midday. And the scriptures tell us clearly that from midday up to 3 o'clock, the land was covered with darkness. It was covered with darkness. And it is also said scientifically that if somebody is crucified, it takes 3 days for the person to die. If it is a healthy person, it takes 3 days for a person to die. And unfortunately here, Jesus' death may not be regarded in a scientific way. It is something bringing a spiritual or theological interpretation in the fulfillment of the sacrificial lamb, a place that Jesus is taking. Secondly, remember that the Passover is going to begin a few hours later on that day. And in order the Passover to take place, human beings and the land must be clean and cleansed. The presence of the dead bodies on the cross would render the nation or the land unclean, and therefore the Passover would not make any sense even if they celebrated it. So what would they do in order to make the land cleansed? They had to take the dead bodies on the cross down. And they would not take them down when alive. They must make them, they should make sure that they are dead. What do? They hurry their death so that they can die. And hurrying their death, they were supposed to go and break their bones, their joints, and then they die very quickly and remove their dead bodies and take them for burial. But what they did not understand in so doing is that since Jesus Christ was going to be the Passover lamb, a Passover lamb was a whole sacrifice. It was not supposed to be broken of any limb, any bones. It was to be offered whole for a complete life. So, by the time they came to hurry up their death, Jesus had already died at the 9th hour. That's where we hear Jesus saying, "It is finished." When he said it is finished, he means what he had come for has been accomplished. He has given his life for the sake of the sinners. They were surprised to come and find that Jesus had died. And when it was reported to Pontius Pilate, it was a surprise. And the only method they could do was to make a test. This time is not a scientific test like in the medical terms where you would want to know whether a person is dead. You would feel the pulse, you would want to see whether the eyes are blinking, whether there is a warmth in the body. You may do many different medical tests to prove that the person is dead. But this was a physical sign that would show that a person is dead, which they used. They took a spear and pierced in his ribs, and we are told that blood and water came out, which I think medically you also can testify that those are signs of a dead person. So after that one, then they required him to be brought down, for the The criminals, those ones might have been having their relatives who took them away. But remember, Jesus has been defined a person with nothing. He owned nothing. And by the time of Jesus' death, of course, we don't see Joseph. We are only seeing Mary the mother. Although he had relatives, really, but I think something different was happening around Jesus. So here comes a man called Joseph of Arimathea, who is referred to as one of the disciples, secret disciples of Jesus. He was a Pharisee and a Sanhedrin member, but he would visit Jesus in secrecy, like we saw Nicodemus. So he came to Pontius Pilate and begged for the body of Jesus to be taken for burial. We are told that this man bought linen and other requirements he offered for Jesus' burial. And he offered his personal tomb, which he was intending to be buried in when he dies. And because time was not on their side, they could not perform the burial rituals, as we said, the prescience we talked about. It was no longer necessary because it had already been done, but according to them, because they didn't understand, they still wanted to offer these services. But Jesus had to be buried hurriedly in order to cleanse the land and to prepare for the Passover. So, Jesus was taken into this tomb. And the Passover was a 24-hour feast from 6 o'clock Friday to 6 o'clock Saturday. So the women who were preparing for the send-off, for the rituals, waited for the end of the Passover feast. And another thing we need to note here is that the counting of days, according to the Jewish traditions, was not a 24-hour day like we count. This was a 12-hour day. That's why we talk about 3 days that he was in the tomb. But in our own counting, it would have been 1 day and a half, 36 hours instead of 72. So we count Friday night, Saturday day, and Saturday night. So when he had just barely been in the tomb 24 hours, that is, in the evening of Saturday, the Passover was over. And the women hurriedly wanted to go and perform the rituals, the burial rites of the dead. They moved quickly towards the tomb. But on the way, they were overtaken by darkness. Secondly, they thought, because in the tomb, they had put there a very big stone covering the entrance, which women were not able to remove. So they are thinking, so since it is dark, we may not be able to do what has brought us. Let us go back and we shall come back tomorrow. But on the other hand, remember, the scriptures tell us that he would spend 3 days in the tomb and he would resurrect. Now, these are not yet 3 days. The problems the women are encountering are intentional because they could not go there and they will not be able to perform because Jesus is not yet in 3 days in the tomb in order to see the miracles that God would be doing through him. So they failed due to time and also the stone which was on the tomb.